On the 12th of March 1946 in Budapest, one of the worst Hungarian war criminals was brought out to a stake, where he was secured for his execution. He was blindfolded, and then stood opposite him was a firing squad who aimed their rifles to take the life of a politician whose work had caused a significant amount of suffering during the Second World War. Hungary as a nation was decimated during World War II, and around 300,000 soldiers from their army and around 600,000 civilians died. Many were deported to concentration camps, where they were slaughtered as soon as they arrived at sites such as Auschwitz. Deals were made with the Nazis, of whom the Hungarians were allied by the Axis alliance, to send people to concentration camps, and thousands of Hungarians were killed each day. The political situation in the country was complex, and there were many different people who rose to prominence at different times, and after the war there were a number of these who were condemned to death. But who was the man who was blindfolded and who was executed by a firing squad? Join us today to look at the execution of the Hungarian Nazi shot by the firing squad, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Ferenc Rajniss was born as Ferenc Rajniss on the 24th of July 1893 inside of Bátyar, which was at the time in Austria-Hungary. His family were Carpathian Germans, and his surname reflected his German links and heritage before he then changed it to a more Hungarian version and name. But as a young man he attended school, then pursued a career in the media, and he worked as a journalist. But he would then become involved in politics and was a fascist, and he was a keen supporter of Hungarian Goebbels, a man who would later become the Prime Minister of Hungary. But despite working in a newspaper, Rajniss would then create and found his own weekly newspaper, named the Magyar Futur, and this was a nationalist newspaper which would carry severely anti-Semitic rhetoric. But surprisingly, as he was a supporter of the Nazis in Germany would give him funding to create this newspaper, and they backed the spread of the ideas through Rajniss's newspaper. The Nazis, despite trying to continue to gain a stranglehold over Germany, would back other countries' movements to spread the ideas of Hitler, as he would one day want to capture these lands. But Rajniss would have two streams of income. One was from his Nazi newspaper, but the other was as he would act as a toy boy and an escort, and there were many wealthy older women who would pay for his company and time. But he was a man who was politically ambitious, and the Nazis also gave him money for his political endeavours, and he would be elected to the Diet of Hungary in the 1930s. This was the parliament of the country, and he was now seen as a prominent politician, but he represented the far-right National Front. But then in October 1937, Rajniss left this group, and he would join with others in launching the United Hungarian National Socialist Party, and this did not succeed as a powerful force. There were attempts in Hungary by politicians to launch a Nazi party, which would unite the different Nazi groups at the time, which were part of different parties, but Rajniss's attempt to bring them all together did not work. There was a significant amount of political turmoil through the time too, as the country would have many different prime ministers, and Rajniss then turned his support to Bela Imredi, and because of this support he joined Imredi's governing party. Imredi would become unpopular with Hitler and Mussolini, as he would try to improve diplomatic relationships with Britain, and he would also try to suppress any rivals to his power. But he would be forced out after less than a year in office, and he would later be sentenced to death at the end of the Second World War. But Ferenc Rajniss then became a member of the Party of National Renewal during the Second World War, but he would continue to try and spread Nazi beliefs and ideas within Hungary. He launched a second newspaper, named the Esti Uzaj, and he would edit this until 1944, and this would propagate pro-Nazi beliefs. Because of this, Rajniss became a trusted ally of the Nazis, and he was working closely with the Reich Security Main Office, and he was an ardent collaborator. The extent of his collaboration is not known, and he may have been someone who would give over Jews to authorities such as the Gestapo, and these would then be sent to concentration camps. But there were mass deportations inside of Hungary during the Second World War. Rajniss would switch his support a number of times, and it seems that he was drawn to power, as he would then support Ferenc Rajniss, who would be another man who would later be executed. But in 1944 he was one of the leaders of the National Federation Parliamentary Group, who were ardent in continuing the war for the Nazis and in support of the German army. Rajniss was involved in Rajniss coming to power, he was then appointed as part of a three-man governing council, which the Germans placed in control over the regent Miklos Horthy, who was ousted from power. Rajniss was now high up in government, and he was clearly someone who the Nazis trusted. The Germans would occupy Hungary in 1944, they would place the regent under house arrest, and the Nazis then placed who they wanted in charge of the Hungarian government. But there were a huge amount of deportations of Jews inside of the lands, as between 450,000 and 606,000 Jews were rounded up, as they were then sent to concentration camps. There was a Nazi operation named Operation Höss, in which over 400,000 Hungarian Jews were sent to Auschwitz, and whilst they were there they were slaughtered in around 8 deadly weeks. The effect of this was that Auschwitz brought back their former commandant Rudolf Höss to carry out the deadly attack, and the camp could not cope, as around 10,000 people were being killed each day. These people were deported from places under the control of men like Rajniss, and he was responsible for the slaughter. But Auschwitz's gas chambers became assisted in the killing operation by firing squads, and the crematoriums could not cope with the amount of bodies, so many were burned in the open in huge pits. But as mentioned, men like Rajniss were responsible for these deportations, and they would negotiate with the Nazis and men like Adolf Eichmann and also organisations like the SS to carry out this attack. But Rajniss was still in government, and he would act as a Minister of Religion and Education in the new government, and would remain in this job until he resigned on the 7th of March 1945. There were issues between him and Salatsi, which forced him to resign, and Rajniss considered Salatsi a fanatic, but as the Second World War came to an end, there were reprisals ordered against those statesmen inside of Hungary who had committed terrible acts during the war. The Soviets would force the Germans out of Hungary, they would expel them from the lands, and would also force them to retreat. The Hungarians did surrender in May 1945, at the end of the war in line with other Axis countries offering their surrender. But as mentioned, there was a lot of anger inside of Hungary, and many wanted those Nazi politicians and those allied Nazi politicians to pay for what had happened inside of the country during World War II. Ferenc Rajniss was arrested following the collapse of his government, and he would be considered a man who had collaborated with the Nazis. His actions had resulted in the deportations and slaughter of thousands, and his actions with his newspapers had helped spread and propagate Nazi beliefs and ideas to a huge extent, bringing it to the population. Because of this, he was brought to trial inside of Budapest, and the courtroom heard of his actions and alliances with the Nazis, who viewed him as a reliable and powerful politician who could help spread their ideas. It was uncovered that the Nazis for years had also been funding his newspapers, and how he had also made different speeches about the Nazis, which were also rather Semitic. As a minister in the Arrow Cross cabinet, he was a senior and was accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. There were also documents found regarding his negotiations with the Nazis and how he was trying to implement Nazi policies inside of Hungary. For this, Ferenc Rajniss was then sentenced to death for war crimes, and he would be seen as a leading Nazi collaborator. His execution took place outside the Academy of Music in Budapest, and he was led out by the police to a stake. The executioners then tied him to this and secured his legs, and also tied his chest to the stake so he could not move. A white handkerchief or a blindfold was then tied over his face, and he could not see the firing squad. Then a number of men were assembled at a very short range with their rifles, and they stood with their weapons aimed, and the order to fire was then given, and instantly Ferenc Rajniss was killed. There were many Hungarian politicians who, after the Second World War had come to an end, were brought to trial. They were then sentenced to death and were executed. The same site of Rajniss's execution became a place where many were executed by firing squads, or where a number were hanged using a pole hanging method, used mostly in Hungary. But Ferenc Rajniss was a journalist and a media powerhouse who used his newspapers to spread the evils of the Nazis, and for this and his actions when he came into power, he would be sentenced to death. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.